Kale had always felt something quietly pressing at the edges of his awareness, like a hand resting just beyond his shoulder, never touching, never leaving. For years he assumed it was nothing more than the usual weight life puts on a person, the lingering tension of unfinished plans, old memories, or unspoken worries. But as he grew older, the feeling didn't fade. Instead, it sharpened. It became more distinct, more deliberate, almost as if it waited for him to notice it fully. And one late evening, deep within the barren outskirts of the Saharan frontier, something finally called his name without using sound. He had been traveling alone for several days, guided not by maps but by a persistent instinct he couldn't explain. The air was warm and still, the kind of stillness that holds its breath. The sand stretched endlessly in every direction, carrying faint ripples shaped by the night winds, and Kale moved through it with a soft sense of resignation, wondering why he had come so far with so little reason. His pack was light, almost empty, and he hadn't spoken to another human in days. But there was something in the atmosphere, a pull, a beckoning, that felt unmistakably alive. As the sun began to fall and the sky shifted toward amber, he noticed a small outcrop of stone jutting out of the sand like the tip of a buried memory. The sight of it stirred something deep in him, a familiarity he couldn't place. He approached slowly, brushing the sand off the surface with the back of his hand. Beneath the dust and heat-smoothed stone was a carving, a spiral surrounded by 3 intersecting lines. It wasn't a symbol he recognized from any culture he'd studied, yet it felt intimate, like déjà vu breathing softly against his thoughts. A faint crack ran down the stone center, and before he could think twice, Kale gripped the edges and pulled. The rock split open with a grainy sigh, revealing an opening beneath his feet. A hidden chamber. He knelt carefully, lowering himself into the glowless space below, guided only by the dim light spilling from the desert sky above. The air was cooler, carrying the faint scent of aged parchment and dust untouched for centuries. Inside, on a small stone pedestal, lay a single manuscript wrapped in darkened linen. Kale's breath slowed as he reached toward it, not with the eagerness of discovery but with the strange tenderness one uses when touching something sacred. The fabric crumbled slightly under his fingers. It had waited far longer than any person should, but the manuscript beneath was intact. Its cover bore the same spiral symbol etched into the surface, deeper and more defined than the one above. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he sat down on the cold stone floor and waited, letting himself adjust to the weight of the moment. Something about the room, the book, the quiet, made him aware of the subtle hum beneath reality, the same hum he had felt since childhood but never quite recognized. Here, it was louder. Clearer. Almost resonant. Finally, he unwrapped the manuscript fully and rested it on his knees. The pages looked impossibly old yet strangely preserved, inked with characters that blended geometric shapes and fluid strokes, a script that felt alive. Kale ran his finger along the first line, and to his surprise, the shapes shifted. They rearranged themselves, dissolving and reforming into a language he could understand, not because he knew it, but because it knew him. The watchers see only shadow, the text began, but the one who remembers light becomes unapproachable to them. Kale blinked slowly, the words settling into him like warm embers. He read the line again, and again it felt less like reading and more like remembering. The manuscript continued, speaking of a forgotten order of seekers who once carried knowledge too powerful, too liberating, to remain in the hands of ordinary rulers. These seekers had hidden their teachings in remote corners of the world, protecting them from those who feared what awakening would mean. As Kale turned to the next page, the symbols shifted into a new sentence. There are phrases that dissolve the chains erected by unseen hands. His breath caught slightly. He wasn't sure why, but he felt the truth of it. Not metaphorical chains. Not poetic imagery. Something literal. Something that had threaded itself silently through the human mind for ages. The manuscript described them in detail, beings of shadow, not evil in any simple sense, but parasitic in their forgetting. Fragments of creation that had lost their connection to light, and thus came to feed on those who still carried it. As he read further, the text gently revealed that some individuals could feel these beings instinctively, even if they didn't know what they were sensing. People who had been born with something brighter inside them, people whom the shadows found difficult to influence unless tricked into forgetting their nature. The manuscript described these people as luminous ones, not because they carried light like a candle, but because they were light in origin. For the first time in his life, Cale understood the pressure he'd felt behind him all these years. That silent heaviness. That strange sense of being watched but not quite seen. It hadn't been anxiety or imagination. It had been the watchers drifting near the edges of his awareness. But now, sitting inside that ancient chamber with the manuscript resting on his knees, Cale didn't feel fear. He felt clarity. A soft breeze drifted through the chamber, though no wind should have reached that far below the sand. It touched his face like a whisper. And in that moment, something inside him shifted, like a lock turning gently. The manuscript seemed to pulse faintly under his hands. Its words described a technique, simple, direct, and powerful, that allowed luminous ones to remember who they truly were. A phrase that didn't force anything, didn't attack anything, but simply lifted the veil enough for the shadows to lose their hold. He traced the final sentence on the page with his finger. Speak not as one seeking light, but as one who already knows its source within. Cale closed the manuscript slowly, holding it against his chest. He didn't need to read any further tonight. He felt something stirring in him, something old, something patient. As though a forgotten part of him had finally exhaled. Outside, the desert sky darkened into a field of stars, each one glimmering with quiet invitation. Cale climbed back to the surface, carrying the manuscript gently in one hand. The pressure behind him, the sense of being watched, felt distant now, softened, almost irrelevant. He didn't know why this knowledge had waited for him specifically. But he knew it had. And he knew this was only the beginning. When Cale woke the next morning, the desert felt different. Not colder, not brighter, simply clearer, as though the air itself had been rinsed of something invisible. The manuscript lay beside him, wrapped again in the softened linen, but even through the fabric he could feel its presence the same way one feels a gentle pulse against the palm. He packed it carefully, slung his bag over his shoulder, and resumed walking toward the distant canyons that marked the next stretch of his wandering. By midday he reached a small ridge overlooking a valley scattered with sandstone pillars. The wind wove quietly between them, carrying a melodic hum that rose and fell in soft waves. Cale paused at the ridge, unsure whether the sound was natural or something else entirely. The manuscript had warned him that once knowledge awakened in someone, the world around them began responding differently, more precisely, more personally. And as he stood there listening to the wind's haunting rhythm, he sensed he wasn't alone. A figure approached slowly from between the pillars. Draped in robes the color of sun-bleached clay, the figure moved with a calm steadiness that made the surrounding air seem to settle. When the figure finally reached Cale, they lowered their hood, revealing a middle-aged woman whose eyes carried the softness of someone who had seen far more than she ever claimed. She offered a small nod, the kind given not to strangers but to someone expected. "You found one of the manuscripts," she said, her voice low and smooth. It wasn't a question. It was recognition. Cale hesitated. You know about it? Only a few do, she replied. My name is Saris. I follow the paths where luminous ones awaken. And last night, a new light stirred. She glanced at the pack slung over Kale's shoulder. It pointed directly to you. Kale wasn't sure what surprised him more, the fact that she knew about luminous ones, or the quiet certainty in her voice, as if what she said needed no justification. He opened his pack and gently revealed the wrapped manuscript. Sarah stepped closer, touching the linen with reverent fingertips. This one teaches remembrance, she murmured. Not belief. Not faith. Pure remembrance. Kale let out a slow breath. I read part of it. The watchers, the shadows, the feeling of being observed. It finally made sense. Saris looked at him with a tenderness that made him feel understood without explanation. Luminous ones sense the watchers long before they know what they're sensing. It's the nature of inner light, it casts shadows even before the flame is recognized. They moved together to a shaded alcove carved naturally into the stone, and Saris gestured for him to sit. She took the manuscript into her own hands and opened it carefully. The pages reacted to her presence, shifting subtly, as if acknowledging another who could read them. She turned to a passage Kale hadn't reached yet. This, she said, is the heart of the teaching. The text shimmered into language Kale could understand. There are 4 words the watchers cannot stand near, for they reveal a truth the shadows cannot approach. She paused before reading the next line. Instead, she closed the manuscript softly, holding the moment like a fragile leaf. Before I speak those words to you, she continued, you must understand why they matter. Kale nodded, leaning in slightly. Your entire life, Sarah said, you've carried something bright inside you. Not a talent. Not a destiny. Just a remembering waiting to wake. Watchers sense that brightness long before you do. They don't attack it. They can't. Instead, they confuse it. They weave forgetfulness. They whisper doubt. They create heaviness. And for most people, that's enough. Kale felt a subtle tightening in his chest, the echo of years spent wondering why simple things felt so strangely heavy. Saris noticed the shift. That weight wasn't yours, she said softly. It was interference, a fog projected toward you. But once someone begins to remember, the fog thins. That's why you felt the world changing when you opened the manuscript. The watchers felt it too. They know when someone is slipping out of their influence. She placed the manuscript on the ground between them. The 4 words you will learn do not fight the watchers. They do not banish them. They do something much simpler. Her voice lowered. They make you unreachable. Kale let the meaning settle. Unreachable, how? Saris drew a circle in the sand with her fingertip. The watchers exist in a band of consciousness built on limitation, fear, confusion, attachment, doubt. They perceive the world through that filter. When someone speaks the 4 words with true recognition, they shift their frequency outside that band. The watchers do not disappear. You simply move beyond their field of perception. Like changing stations on a radio, Kale murmured. Exactly, Saris said, smiling. They can no more detect you than a fish can detect a bird flying overhead. The worlds are too far apart. He took a slow breath. And these 4 words shift me into that higher space? They uncover the part of you already in that space, she corrected gently. They don't create anything new. They remind you of what has always been true. Kale's heartbeat steadied. What are the words? Saris didn't answer immediately. She watched him with quiet focus, as though measuring whether the moment was ready. Then she leaned closer and spoke them softly, each word carrying a weight both simple and profound. I am the light. The words seemed to echo inside Kale, not in his ears but deeper, like they struck the center of something he'd forgotten. A warmth spread across his chest, subtle at first, then widening into a soft radiance that pressed gently outward. He whispered them again to himself, almost afraid to exhale. I am the light. Saris nodded slowly. Not, I seek the light. Not, I follow the light. Not, I hold the light. You are the light. That is the truth the Watchers cannot navigate. They exist only in shadow, and shadow has no pathway to the source. Kale inhaled deeply, feeling an unmistakable shift within, like an inner sunrise stretching its first rays across the dimness of his awareness. Saris continued, her voice steady and grounding. The phrase is not an affirmation. It is not meant to inspire you. It is a declaration of identity. When said with recognition, the Watchers lose their perception instantly. They do not retreat. They simply stop being able to find you. Kale closed his eyes. The desert breeze brushed gently across his face, carrying a strange clarity he'd never felt before. For the first time, his mind felt like a room with open windows. What happens next? He asked softly. Saris folded her hands in her lap. Tonight, when you sleep, you will say the phrase again. That is when its power anchors most deeply. Your consciousness will shift in ways the Watchers cannot reach. And tomorrow, the world will respond to you differently. Kale opened his eyes slowly, the valley before him shimmering with a quiet presence. He felt as though he were finally seeing the world without a veil. He whispered the phrase one more time, letting it resonate through him like a gentle bell. I am the light. Night settled over the valley like a slow-moving tide, filling every crevice of stone with shadowed blue. Kale sat near a small fire Saris had kindled, its flames flickering gently against the canyon walls as if unsure whether to hold steady or sway with the cooling breeze. The air carried a soft chill, but it wasn't uncomfortable, more like the breath of a world preparing itself for an inner turning. Across the fire, Saris sat quietly with her hands resting on her knees, eyes half closed, listening in that way she always did, as if the silence spoke more clearly than most people ever could. Kale felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, simply more aware. It reminded him of waking from a long, dreamless sleep and realizing his senses had been dimmed without his permission. Now everything seemed sharper. The sound of the fire, the glow of the embers, the subtle pulse of warmth in his chest, they unfolded with a quiet intensity he hadn't known he was capable of perceiving. Saris finally opened her eyes and looked at him. This is the night, she said with a soft smile. The shift begins now. Kale nodded. He knew what she meant. Ever since she'd spoken the 4 words earlier that day, those words had been repeating themselves inside him, not as thoughts but as something deeper, like a subtle alignment occurring beneath his awareness. He could feel their shape, their weight, as though each time they echoed within him, another unseen thread loosened. When you speak the phrase before sleep, Saris continued, it seals the remembrance. Not as a momentary state, but as a living identity. The Watchers move through the corridors between waking and dreaming, searching for minds dimmed by forgetfulness. Tonight, you will not be one of them. He studied the flames for a long moment. Saris, what exactly happens when they lose their ability to perceive someone? Do they simply drift away? She considered the question carefully. Watchers are drawn not to people, but to forgetfulness. They feed on the subtle fog that forms when someone forgets their nature. When a luminous one remembers, that fog dissolves. Without it, the watchers have nothing to attach to. Nothing to sense. They don't drift away, they simply cease to recognize your existence. Her voice lowered. It's like stepping beyond the borders of a map they were trained to navigate. Cale allowed her words to settle. The idea didn't frighten him. It felt strangely natural, as though he had always been meant to step out of that map. The fire crackled softly. Somewhere above them, an owl glided across the canyon, its wings slicing through the night with effortless grace. Cale watched its silhouette for as long as he could, then slowly stood and walked toward a flat section of stone where the moonlight pooled like silver water. He sat down and closed his eyes, breathing slowly. Each inhale felt like drawing the world inward, each exhale felt like giving something back. Behind him, he sensed Saris watching, not with expectation but with gentle faith. Cale placed a hand over his heart. Not because Saris told him to, she hadn't, but because it felt right. The warmth he had noticed earlier stirred beneath his palm, spreading in calm waves through his chest. It wasn't heat. It wasn't emotion. It was recognition. Saris spoke softly from behind him, her voice almost blending with the breeze. When you say the words, don't force anything. Don't try to feel powerful. Don't try to feel different. Speak as though you're simply acknowledging something that's been true for longer than you've lived. He nodded lightly and inhaled again. Silence settled around him, full and steady. Then Cale spoke. I am the light. The words left him gently, almost without effort. And as soon as they did, he felt a subtle shift, like a lantern being uncovered inside his chest. Not bright, not blinding, just present. Soft. Steady. He remained still for a moment, letting the words ripple outward in ways he couldn't fully understand. Then he spoke again. I am the light. This time, the warmth spread farther, reaching the space behind his sternum, rising up through the base of his throat. It wasn't emotion. It wasn't energy. It was identity settling into place. Like a piece of himself he had forgotten was finally returning home. Saris said nothing. She didn't need to. Cale breathed out slowly, closing his eyes more fully, as though sinking deeper into himself. The night felt thicker now, not oppressive, but intimate, cocoon-like. Even the wind had softened, as if waiting respectfully. He spoke the phrase one final time. I am the light. This time, everything changed. The warmth inside his chest blossomed outward, not explosively but expansively. It moved through him like the opening of 1,000 tiny windows, allowing something gentle and ancient to flow through. The edges of his awareness brightened, not visually, but perceptively, as if a soft white hum had begun resonating through the space behind his thoughts. He felt himself grow, quieter. Not mute, but still. Like the internal noise he'd carried all his life had finally dissolved. Then came the shift. It wasn't sudden. It was like a soft curtain lifting. The world around him felt closer somehow, more honest, more transparent. The shadows at the edges of the canyon thinned, not disappearing but losing their weight, their density. And the pressure he had felt his entire life, that strange presence lingering behind him, simply wasn't there anymore. Not muted. Not distant. Gone. He opened his eyes slowly and saw the canyon as though for the first time. The rocks glowed faintly under the moonlight. The fire flickered with a rhythm he felt inside his heartbeat. Even the silence had changed, it felt alive, aware, welcoming. Saris approached and sat beside him, not speaking for a long moment. When she finally placed a hand gently on his shoulder, her touch carried a quiet affirmation. "It is done," she whispered. "The Watchers cannot perceive you now." Kale exhaled softly, the breath leaving him with a sense of release that felt almost sacred. "I thought it would feel more dramatic," he admitted quietly. Saris smiled. "Remembering is rarely loud. It doesn't shout. It simply reveals." She looked up at the moon, its pale glow reflecting in her eyes. "The world recognizes you differently now. And you will recognize it differently as well." Kale folded his hands loosely in his lap, letting the last of the inner warmth settle. He didn't feel shielded or protected, nothing so defensive. Instead, he felt present. Whole. Unobscured. "The Watchers won't try again?" he asked. "They can't," Saris said gently. "You've moved beyond the range where shadow can linger. From this night forward, their influence can no longer reach you." Kale gazed out across the canyon, feeling something new stirring in him, not power, but clarity. A simple, grounded awareness that felt like the beginning of a life he hadn't known he was missing. He whispered the phrase one last time, not out of need but gratitude. "I am the light." The air embraced him softly. And for the first time in his life, the night felt like home. When Kale finally lay down to rest that night, the canyon wrapped itself around him like a quiet guardian. Not a single movement in the darkness felt intrusive anymore. The world breathed in a slower rhythm, as if matching the calm that now filled his chest. Nothing chased him, nothing hovered behind him, and nothing tried to slip into the thinning gaps of his awareness. For the first time, sleep arrived not as an escape but as an unfolding, a soft descent into a space that had waited for him far longer than he realized. In his dreams, the same warmth that had bloomed within him continued to expand, not outward into the world but deeper into himself, illuminating corners he had forgotten existed. And wherever that inner light touched, old heaviness dissolved like mist under sunlight. There were no Watchers in that dream space. No echoes of old fears. Only a vast, steady presence, his own, stretching quietly into a landscape of clarity. Kale understood then that nothing external had freed him. No ritual, no symbol, no hidden manuscript had granted him power. They had only reminded him of what had been resting inside him all along, a light that never flickered, even when obscured, even when overlooked. A light that didn't need to defeat shadows to remain itself. By morning, the canyon seemed brighter, though the sun had barely risen. Saris watched him emerge from sleep with a knowing smile. He didn't recount his dreams. He didn't need to. She could see it in the way he stood, the way his breath moved, the way the world responded around him. The remembrance was complete. And whatever path came next would grow from that inner brightness, not from fear or pursuit, but from the clarity of being. Kale stepped into the new day quietly, carrying nothing and lacking nothing.